So I don't have any like big announcements for the course. You should have all had your exam one graded, and you can be in contact with me or your TAs about any of the questions if you have concerns or want to discuss them a little bit further or need some clarity. And just as a reminder, I can field all the questions myself for the multiple choice true false, so the first half of the exam. I can take questions on the short answer as well. I'd be happy to clarify things. The only thing with that though is I suggest you start with your TA because those are who graded your short answer questions, so they can give you better feedback on why they took points off, and they can also award points back if you have a good biological explanation or they miss something. But again, they don't have to award points back, but there is that possibility. And then we have our second exam coming up. This is, only a 7-week course, so it's pretty quick. We average maybe about an exam a week. Maybe there's a little bit longer time period some weeks, but our exam is coming up on Friday. So I think, this would be a good opportunity to, ask questions about it or, review some concepts. But with that, I'll go ahead and we can turn it over to the group if anybody has any specific questions or topics they want to talk about.
Me personally, I'm kind of just catching up on everything right now. I know, I think in topic 5, when they were talking or when they had that activity concerning what variables and what equation for the heat flux of different types would change, it was a little weird. Like some of the variables in here, I think it's the condensation one. A couple of them are called constants, but the answers, I think it was further down when it had it was actually asking what part of what what variable of what equation would change based on what you can observe in the picture. And some of them, like the Cogs book said it was a constant of some variety, and it turns out that the answer was that constant was the thing that would change. Yeah, it's a
It's one
couple
of
of
these, and it might be related to radiation because depending on the amount of heat conductivity. So I think one of the examples were like this question talked about will gain more heat by radiation, even though they're the same size, the same organism, and like both are laying down. What could change here was absorption of via radiation because of the colors. And that's part of the equation for radiation is the heat conduction, and that can change based on the color of the object or what the object is made out of. So if you say for a rock of granite, say that is going to have a constant value, but then if you say a rock made out of clay, the constant that represents that heat conductivity for the rock will change based on which type of rock it is.
So we shouldn't assume that it's a constant or technically a constant unless they give us a solid number for it, like the Stefan-Boltzmann constant.
Yeah, some of the equations are going to have I think that's in modeling heat flux. I just want to make sure. Yeah, because certain things, like temperature, air temperature, surface area, those things are all going to change. But yeah, in radiation, it's the term is the Stefan-Boltzmann constant. That is a given number, but the E value or the emissivity, that can how strong. Let me share my screen again. I'm sorry, I found it in the text. So this is the equation here where the Stefan-Boltzmann constant right here, that is going to be this constant numerical value right here. But this term for emissivity, that can range from 0 to 1. So even though it is kind of classified as a constant, it depends on what the object is for radiation, where it can change. But for a given object, for like a tree, say that's 0.5, For a piece of granite, that might be 0.7. For water, it might be 0.2. So for an object, it's constant, but if that object changes, and parts of an object can change, like in the example with the cats, the color of their fur, that can affect radiation, how much it absorbs based on the color of the fur. So that can range from 0 to 1.
Okay. I mean, I don't know. That one, I think I answered surface area. I figured it had something to do with the color of the fur, but I also figured the fur color would change that that squiggly E one. I forget what you called it.
Yeah, the emissivity.
Yeah, because that one, like I guessed the emissivity one, and it said that it was incorrect. So just it
so
it
is
seems a
there-
little weird.
So it's not this exact question then, because this one just says which organism A or B will gain more.
Yeah, I
heat.
think it was on the next one.
So-
And then the one with the two foxes. So I thought it was talking about conductivity or I think that was the one talking about conductivity and how insulation, but the L for that is talking about the amount of insulation that the heat transfer has to go through, right? Or
Yeah,
is that
it's essentially the distance that heat has to go through. So if you have more thicker feathers, thicker fur, longer fur, or in like seals, they have layers of blubber. Yeah, so it's essentially the distance that energy has to travel, and it dissipates as it travels that distance, and it's harder to penetrate and it's harder to escape. Trying to find the specific question you're talking about.
think it was either this one or it was it might have been another one after, but I think it was this one because it said it was the ambient temperature of the environment, not the insulation on the animal. That was the difference.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, you and I had the same question on this one, I think.
yeah. So I think
Oh.
what they're, and honestly, for an exam sake, if you talked about L, because clearly I would say they have different types of coats because they're in different environments. This one is thicker than this one. Also, their ear size, so they have more surface area on this organism than this one does. It's a little more compact. And that's just through adaptation in different environments. But what they're getting at here is, I think what they meant to say is they should have used the same animal, in my opinion, and said all being equal, what would be different in the equation? And the idea is, I don't particularly like this picture because the first one, they want you to focus on the snow and they blur it out. I don't know why they do that. And the second one, they want you to focus on the sand to show that it's a desert environment and it's presumably warmer, but that it's a kind of a dark photo. I wish they would have added a little context to this, but they could have said, an organism in an Arctic environment that's cold versus an organism in a warm desert environment. That would have given you the abiotic condition differences and, getting to the conclusion that ambient temperature is the driving factor here would have been, much easier to get to.
Versus just like poking and prodding and just taking a wild guess in the air.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a wild guess because the two, you cued in on one variable L, which is important. So I think you had, you knew kind of what you're getting to, but it could have made it a little more clear if they would have had a little bit more detail on the environment. Or they could have said which part of the convection heat flux differs the most. And then you could argue because the insulation isn't, totally extreme difference between these two, but the temperature extreme difference could be, very different between Arctic and desert. The word most in there, yeah, this question could be improved. But does it make sense now what they're getting at?
Yeah, I kind of figured like that was what it was, but I think it has a lot to do with the quality of the photo because I was not focusing on the environment part of it.
Mhm. And just, but recalling the equation for convection, environmental temperature is part of it. So just I mean, for future reference, just know like it could be any part of that equation. It could be the
Yeah.
insulation, it could be the environment, so take all things into consideration.
I was also looking at the wrong equation, so that didn't help me.
Yeah, that's fair then, that would, we'd be missing some information. So. I think it's a good topic to talk about, because you will see similar questions to the activities like this on the exam. And some of the same photos have been taken from the activities, so you're familiar with them. So if there's any photos that anybody has questions or concerns about, maybe this is a good time to clarify what exactly we're looking at in the photo.
So I had a question. Like, I just don't understand convection. Like, how do I differentiate that from conduction? I know it has something to do with water, but like if I see a picture of a fish in water, I don't know how I know that's convection. Because I don't only want to just assume that just because it's in water, because I'm not really understanding it then.
Why is water important for convection? Let's maybe start there.
I thought convection was the movement of liquids or gases around the animal.
Yes,
So are you-
that is correct.
So like, are you losing like body heat to that, or you gain, like, I don't think I fully understand. You know what I mean?
The rate of energy transfer through water is much faster than it is through air. So if you're in the water, you're either going to gain heat or you're going to lose heat at a higher rate than if you're in the same temperature in the air environment.
Okay, so it's
The
just,
heat capacity in water is greater than it is in air.
oh, okay, that makes sense.
And it's not, if you see a picture with water, 99% of the time it's going to be
Yeah.
convection. So just,
Okay.
if you see any, aquatic animals, that's a safe starting place, but it's important to understand the why, and that gets at the
Okay.
heat capacity.
Okay, thank
And
you.
yeah, and conduction, I mean, they are kind of related, so we could expand on this. Conduction is physical contact of one object with another object. So I think a lot of examples were lizards on rocks. And
Uh-huh.
convection is physical contact with an object. It could be that same lizard, but it's a type of either like a liquid or a gas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Is it still safe to assume that we'll have these equations provided if they're needed, like last exam? Or are we gonna have to memorize stuff?
You're gonna have to know these equations in a sense that what's in the equations based on the energy
Like what the
flow.
variables mean?
Yes, but you will not have to do any calculations with them, and you will not have to write them out. But it might ask you
Okay.
like which part of the convection equation is affected by this. And
Oh, so
there-
like those
Yeah,
practice questions.
you might get a
Okay.
couple like that. So it's a little different use of the equations than we did last time. So we're not doing any math with them. It's all conceptual.
Okay, as long as we understand, we should be okay.
Yes, but you will have to know the variables in the equation. Like if it's multiple choice, you should be able to recognize it, because obviously they're going to have 4 different variables to choose from, and they might mix, some from radiation and some from convection. So knowing, which ones to look for is going to be helpful.
Okay,
Does that clarify the question?
I think so.
How many questions will there be on this exam?
Hand, I forget exactly how many questions it is. It's going to be the same exact format as the previous one, where 50 points are going to
Yeah.
be multiple choice, true, false, at 2 points apiece. So there'll be 25 of those. And then there's a series of short answer also worth 50 points, which is there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 short answer questions.
Okay. So 30 something questions then in
Yeah.
total?
I think 30 exactly on this one.
Okay,
But there'll always be anywhere from like 29 to 34 questions, just depending on how many points the short answers are worth.
okay.
I mean, how many points they're worth a piece.
I have another question.
Sure.
So endothermic organism produce their own heat and maintain the temperature, right? The inside temperature.
Yes, yeah, the first part, and endotherms produce enough metabolic heat that's excess that they can use that as their heat source. They don't have to derive it from the environment. So endo meaning internal, their heat comes from within, and most endotherms have fairly stable body temperatures.
Okay. So can endotherm also be considered homeotherm since they maintain the body temperature to be constant?
Yes, you can have a homeothermic endotherm.
Okay.
Yeah, so combining those terms, that's a good question. What about an ectotherm? Can you have a homeothermic ectotherm?
The tuna, I think in the cogbook. I think they had some examples in cogbook. I have to go back and read it, but I
But
think
I mean, it doesn't have to be a real animal, just theoretically, right? Let's think about it. If it's an ectotherm, we said, what does that mean now? Because we defined homeotherm.
ectotherm
Temperatures.
is based on the outside environment.
Yeah,
The
so a lizard, for example, is a good, ectotherm. They have to derive energy from the sun or from a warmed up rock.
Yeah.
But can a lizard then, because it's ectotherm, can it maintain a fairly stable body temperature, or do they have to be a pykotherm that has a variable body temperature?
Yes, I think they can maintain if they stand on their legs and
That was one of the examples, but what is that if they may, the answer is yes, I agree with you. They can maintain fairly stable body temperatures. And what is the physical process of maintaining a stable body temperature called from cogbooks? Does anybody remember that term?
I don't remember.
Is that,
It's not homeostasis, is it?
That's not the term I'm looking for. Homeostasis kind of falls in that range, but
is it a
Thermoregulation.
yes, exactly, thermoregulation. And animals typically thermoregulate two main ways. Do you remember how they do that? There's two big mechanisms that they can do it.
Metabolic or behaviorally?
Exactly. And I would just call that behavioral or physiological. And metabolic is the way they physiologically do it.
And behavioral would be seeking like a shade area and stuff like that.
Yep, when they get too warm, they can move into the shade to avoid solar radiation. And if they get cool enough, they can move out of that and go into the sun. So they call it shuttling. It goes back and forth between two different microclimates. It can maintain a very stable body temperature in an environment. And it can maintain a body temperature that you actually can't find in that environment because it's a balance act between the sun and the shade. So the frequency of that movement or the duration of which they stay in one or another environment can determine what their actual body temperature is.
Okay. Thanks.
That was good questions.
and then I just had a question. I think it was on like the objective, like to describe the challenge that aquatic plants face when acquiring carbon dioxide.
Sure.
Was that just that CO2 in the form of gas is limited? So
That's-
they,
Go ahead.
so they get it from the bicarbonate mineral.
Yes, the statements you said are correct. Like the first part is saying that CO2 diffuses very slowly into water. Plants can get pure CO2 directly from water, but it might not be at high enough levels for them to survive. So then you brought up the second point that when CO2 dissolves in water, it often combines and forms other compounds. So it can form, what is it, H2CO3, the carbonic acid. And then plants can take those molecules up quicker and actually break those down internally. So they have two mechanisms or two routes, if you want to call it, of absorbing CO2.
Okay.
And the adaptation is being able to absorb the carbonic acid or the other forms of combined CO2 in the environment and break those down internally and convert them into CO2.
Okay. All right.
Uh, On that one, I did want to say at some point they talked about there's essentially some kind of similar to a boundary, that still air boundary layer, except the water version of it. And they were talking about how the CO2, like whatever's dissolved in the water, diffuses much more slowly into that boundary layer that the plants initially take it from, which is why they do, isn't one of the other adaptations they can release hydrogen ions into the water to force the chemical reaction to shift so that it creates more CO2?
Or does it, I think it's, they do produce the extra hydrogen to combine with CO2 in the environment to form carbonic acid on the outside and then take that in and break it down?
I believe so,
Yeah,
because I think one of the problems was that boundary.
I can study with those, with that.
Do you mind muting yourself? Real quick, if. Thank you. All right, sorry, go ahead.
I thought like the challenge, like that question that she was talking about was asking about was like part of that kind of boundary layer thing that they've got going on in the water.
It's related to that. I mean, that's an additional part that we hadn't talked about, so that's a good point to bring up if you want to explain that again the way you did.
Cause like I think it was it was one of the other forms that had to do when they mentioned the still air boundary convection. So when they were talking about convection, they were talking about that still air layer that surrounds the animal.
Mhm.
And there's basically an underwater version of that surrounds the entire surface area of the plants. And what the plants take from is actually the CO2 in that boundary layer, and that the boundary layer takes a long time for CO2 or bicarbonate, anything outside of that layer, to diffuse into it for the plant to use. So the plant has to emit hydrogen ions to force the reaction to cause, there's something, it was a different form that breaks. No, yeah, I think it was to force bicarbonate to break down faster into CO2 so that it can absorb it through that boundary layer or something like that. Was that what that was talking about?
That gets at the size of the molecules a little bit, that certain molecules can diffuse through that boundary layer faster or more easily than others.
Oh, okay, so then by releasing the hydrogen ions and it breaks it down, it makes it easier for it to diffuse into that layer.
Yes.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, no, but that was a great point.
Yeah, I feel a little uncertain about everything in T6. But what Kira was just talking about with the aquatic plant adaptations. So do we need to understand how the carbonic acid and bicarbonate turns into CO2? Like, do we need to know those chemical equations?
No, if you write out the word bicarbonate or carbonic acid, that would be fine. I don't expect you to know the chemistry of it, but knowing that CO2 or carbon dioxide is important and that it's the carbonic acid, those two, either spell it out or write that equation out, but you don't have to say how it breaks apart, like it loses 2 oxygens or something like that. Like that's not going to be necessary, that level of detail, just the conversion of one compound to another, and which compound the plant is trying to take up and why it struggles to do so and how it has adapted to do it in another pathway.
Okay, I had another question on that same the stress adaptations with the saltwater adaptations and aquatic vertebrates and the way they excrete ammonia. Can you go through that process a little bit? That was in T6.
Was that the one with the sharks and the rays? They use that to raise their cell solute concentration so they don't keep losing water.
Yeah, I got a little lost in, they turn ammonia into urea and then excrete it. Is that correct? Am I understanding
It
that
said
correct?
they only excrete some of it, but they keep a very high concentration in their body so that it causes an equilibrium between their blood and the salt water so that they don't lose water when they're swimming in the ocean.
Okay, so that's their form of osmoregulation.
Think that?
Yeah, well, let's back it up maybe to the very beginning. Like, what's the problem that saltwater animals face?
The osmotic potential change between the body and the ocean, it's either going to, or well, for saltwater animals, they will lose water because
Yes.
the cell concentration, the solute concentration in the cells is lower than what's in the ocean.
Yeah, so they have a problem retaining water, and they have tons of solutes because around them. But what they do is when they eat, when they drink, they take in a lot of solutes. And what they want to do is keep the water that comes with that and pass the solutes out to maintain a homeostasis. And they do that, depending on the organism. I mean, animals have to excrete. So I think they have the image is with a dolphin that converts it into ammonia and excretes ammonia. And with sharks and rays, they change that ammonia into urea and then excrete some of the urea, as was stated, but then retain some of that urea. So they essentially, which can be converted back into water and retained in their system. Knowing the actual chemical processes of that is not vital or important. I don't even think Cogbooks really talks about it. So we don't have to get into a ton of detail. I think the important part is just knowing the difference of the problems they face and some of the potential adaptations that they've evolved to deal with the problem of losing water. And we talked about osmosis a little bit, but what are two other mechanisms that animals use for dealing with solute regulation here? How do they physically move solutes around?
Active transport.
Yes, and what is active transport again?
It's the movement of the molecules and ions against a concentration gradient, and then passive transport is with the concentration.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the second question I was going to ask. So you have active transport and passive transport. Passive transport goes with its concentration gradient. So it goes from high concentration to low concentration. So that's where water would easily diffuse out of their system, and salt to bring in would be difficult because they have to go against the concentration gradient. What about freshwater animals? If we want to talk the same kind of pathways, what problem do they face?
It's the reverse where they have to take in the solutes and keep too much water from entering the body because they have a higher solute concentration. And if it did, their cells would explode and they would die or something like that.
Yeah, well, they have the problem of too much water, right? So they can get diluted very easily because when they drink in water, now there's very little solutes that come in it. And if they pass that, then they lose their solutes, but they need some solutes for other chemical reactions in their body. So they need to hold in some of the solutes. Right, so it's just the opposite problem. And
Okay,
for
so
them, they pass it with their urine, and their kidneys do a good job of filtering out water and solutes and retaining water or retaining solutes depending on what the balance in their system is.
so the freshwater ones are hyperosmotic and then saltwater is hypoosmotic?
Yes.
Okay.
In relation to that, would they both be considered using active transport?
Yes, they both will regularly use active transport to go against their concentration gradients, right? Because they're in very either very dilute or very solute or solute rich environments. So neither environment is in homeostasis with their internal body. So to maintain that homeostasis, they have to use, that active transport to maintain the balance.
So another question I had was I think it was maybe objective 11. It was determine whether phenotypes resulted from natural selection or genetic drift. And I just wasn't sure how you would how I would determine that.
think if that's related to any of those activities specifically.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure.
What is it? It's asking you to tell the difference between something occurred via genetic drift and something that occurred via natural selection.
Yes, given the environmental conditions, because it gave us a lot of,
I'm not sure, sorry, if that was related to like directional selection and like stabilizing. I was just a little confused on that one.
sure, and I don't,
I mean, maybe because directional usually, no, wait, no, I'm crazy. I mean, I want to say like, because I feel like the genetic drift one, the phenotypes occur like in Hawaii. A bunch of the animals from the mainland that had adaptations to avoid predators, when they moved over there were no predators. They lost all of those adaptations. And basically their genes became so different from the origin species that they aren't even the same species anymore. I feel like that would be something that you could kind of automatically distinguish as something occurring via genetic drift, because it doesn't do anything for them in terms of survival, or it's not beneficial to their survival.
I think we're on the right track for sure. My thoughts with that one would be that if it's natural selection, like this was an example of a type of selection where they measured, this is directional selection now, right? Where they measured the beak depth of these birds, and then there was a drought, and then they measured this 2 years later, and they found that it shifted. So because we know the environmental conditions, there was a drought, that is likely what pushed it in this direction. So this would be an example of like natural selection.
Mhm.
If it said in an example, say there was, an island population of birds, and then their beak size was this, but then there was a big storm that came in and killed off 75% of those birds, and then nothing else in the environment really changed, and then they measured it 2 years later and the beak size had changed, that would likely be due to that storm and the alleles that survived in the remaining population. And if it differed, then it would probably be the result of genetic drift.
All right, thank you so much.
No problem. And I don't think there's a specific activity with that. It's kind of just drawing on what is going to drive natural selection and what is going to drive genetic drift. And with natural selection, it's going to be related to, traits are selected for generally if they enhance survival. So if something changed that changed their level of survival, that again would be natural selection. But if it's that chance event of a storm is a good, or a fire, or maybe a virus hits that island really hard, then that might, the survivors that recover, that would be by chance, and that would be the genetic drift for part.
Okay, that makes sense.
So then would we be looking for that based on the history of the area more so than just looking at the organisms in the area?
Yeah, you would have to be provided, because what is it, given information about
Oh, okay.
environmental conditions. Yeah, so that, I think that's what that means by the environmental conditions. You would have,
Okay, it almost sounded like there's a way to tell just like by looking at the animal.
not that I'm aware of at this moment, but yeah, I think it has to do, we said the history of what happened to that animal's environment.
So like some sort of catastrophic environmental event, like an earthquake or a fire or something, isolates a population and they evolve a certain way because of that, that would be considered genetic drift.
Yes, or you take a subsample, like another example of genetic drift is you have, say, birds on the mainland, and then there's an island that they haven't colonized, but a storm comes and it blows a small population from the mainland to that island, and then the survivors are going to, depending on, that could actually be both. I guess now that I talk about it out loud, like, right, the survivors are going to have a small subsample of the genetic makeup of the mainland. If that island has this identical conditions, and they evolve differently, then it would be evidence of genetic drift. But potentially if that island has different conditions, they could adapt to that island, and that could be evolution via natural selection. Does that make sense with the two examples of blowing off the mainland to the island?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Can we go over positive and negative selection real quick?
Sure.
So positive selection is, say there's a genetic trait, let's use the birds with the beaks. So positive selection is that the birds that can eat that type of nut are positive selected. So that's positive selection, and birds that have a smaller beak and can't eat crack those hard shells, that would be an example of negative selection. Am I understanding that correctly?
Kind of, but I think the wording's a little different. We would call that directional selection, right? And it could go, you can have positive or negative directional selection. And let's take a look at one of the activities so we can visualize this a little bit. So can everybody see the four figures, right?
Yes.
Okay, so
Oh, that
we have
one.
down here, we have disruptive, positive directional, and negative directional, and stabilizing. So which one would be negative and positive directional selection? Let's start with those, since that's what we're talking about.
Negative is the one where the slope is going down over time,
So we're gonna say it's
right?
this one, right?
Yeah, and then positive would be the upper one that's going up.
And what are we considering? Like, why is this negative? Like, how are we reading this? We talk about the axes. We have phenotypic value on the x-axis and relative fitness on the y-axis. And what are we looking for in these
Be a
figures?
negative slope on the negative directional, right?
Yeah.
That's one way to look at it, right? We have
relative.
negative.
Relative fitness is the chance of survival, correct?
Yes, it's related to survival and reproduction. Fitness is
Right.
got a few things in it.
Right, but so the negative directional, they have a lower chance of, like, a higher chance of not reproducing, and additional, like, other variable factors within that, right? As far as relative fitness.
But what does an organism strive for in relative fitness? Do they want a high, a medium, or a low value of relative fitness?
High, right?
Yeah, right. So, and it's because it's selection. We talked about natural selection is going to retain traits that increase fitness. So where on the x-axis is the highest fitness?
At the beginning.
Yeah, so and that's part of the negative, right? We're going to go to a lower phenotypic value. So we're selecting to the left because that is going to result in the highest relative fitness. And on positive directional selection, we're going to go in a positive direction because it's the opposite, right? The values go up as the phenotypic value increases.
Okay.
So that's part of the positive direction, and then the negative direction. And we can also visually see it like this has a negative slope and this has a positive slope. So there's kind of two ways to visualize positive and negative.
Okay. Now I got I got all of these right when I guessed them, but I don't actually understand the disruptive and stabilizing. I know that stabilizing is the one where the curve peaks.
Yeah, so stabilizing would be this one, right?
Yeah.
And then disruptive would be this one. So if we think about the word stabilizing, what do we tend to think of?
Kind of middle of the road, moderate.
Intermediate values, right? So the extremes are going to have lower levels of fitness than the intermediate values because it stabilizes in the middle, right? And disruptive does the opposite. It actually, the extremes have the highest level of fitness. So it's going to disrupt the stability and push it to the extremes. And when you stabilize, it's going to bring it together in an intermediate.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I guess it just wasn't described well for me to understand it.
We live in a world of extremes.
Yes, we do.
There's no
That's fair.
chill.
And then just to make sure that we're correct, yep, there we go. We got those correct. Then I think, are these all kind of the same?
relatively the same. I think it was just like, I think the one that got even messier was this one.
Okay, yeah, and this is similar, but now it's another layer added on, so that makes sense, that it's a little messier. So when it asks optimal phenotype, so where are we getting the optimal phenotype from on this figure? Is that going to come from the y-axis or the x-axis?
The x-axis.
Yes, so the optimal phenotype is going to be one of these values from 0 to whatever it is. And the numbers are arbitrary. They're just going from a low to a high value. But how do we know what's optimal?
By the relative fitness.
Yeah, so we want to
The
match
y-axis,
up. Sorry, what was that?
by the y-axis.
Yeah, so we want to find on the y-axis, an organism wants the highest fitness possible. And to figure that out, you draw a line across and you just find the highest points on this plot, right? So the highest points are going to be somewhere in this area. And if we go, because we draw that line, and then from there, we draw a line straight down, and it's going to be somewhere around 20. So the closest value here is probably, I would say, 22, right? So somewhere around here. What about A? How are we going to figure that one out?
Less than 50?
Okay, so we're saying,
Or wait, no, am I reading that wrong?
well,
No,
where-
you're right.
well,
I don't know which direction what mouth means anymore.
sorry, you don't know what direction what means?
The mouth, the thingy.
Oh,
The
so this
arrow
would be
thing.
X is greater than 50. This is X is greater than 19. So, but where do we look again for finding, we want the highest points, right? So these are the highest points over here. And if we go down, it would be 0, right?
Yeah.
This is the phenotypic value. I mean, we could really call it A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then A would be, it's an arbitrary value for what we're concerned with, but this aligns with the highest points. So this would be 0. And then what about this one? Where are the points the highest here?
Right around 19.
Yeah,
So
right
that
on the far right. So then we draw the line down, and it's going to be, it could continue. So we would say, is it greater than 50? Yes. But is it, it's greater than 19 a better answer? I would say,
Only because it doesn't go until 50.
it's the closest one to what we can see, right? So this is 19 is the value. So it's 19. I mean, and because it's a process of elimination, if it was a, is the answer greater than 50 true or false? Then it would be true, right? It is greater than 50, potential, or it could go in that direction. Like you could make an argument for that. I shouldn't say it's necessarily exactly true, but you could make that argument. But then if we look at this one's the one that's maybe a little bit more challenging because you have some high values over here, but the highest values are actually to the right extreme. And then because that's associated with 50, that's why this is like the better answer for 19 and 50. Because I mean, it's greater than 50, so it could really be, 100. We don't know. We'd have to do more experiments to collect more data to ensure that it's actually around 50, and we don't get some more points out here eventually. And the same thing with here, because we see points at 19, that's why we just choose greater than 19. Yeah, and then those are correct. All right, is there another? Yeah, let's try it one more time to make sure we're all on the same page in understanding this. So for A, what would be the answer and why? Like, how do we get there?
Less than 135,
And why is that the answer?
because the highest values are on that side.
Yeah, exactly, right? The highest points with the highest fitness are over here around 135. And it seems the trend is if we keep going to the left, we might get higher fitness. So that's why it would be less than 135. What about B? Where are the highest points there roughly?
44, between 40 and 45. So probably 44.
Yes, somewhere in the middle to start with, right? So somewhere in this, yeah. So I would say 44 seems like the best choice there. And then C, we have the opposite of A, right? Where the relative fitness increases with phenotypic value, so it's going to be farthest to the right, which this is around 12. And then this is again a form of stabilizing selection where it's in the middle. And if we drop it down, sure, it's going to be somewhere around 68. So call it that. Just to double check. Yeah, we got those all correct. So is this making a little more sense on where the optimal phenotype comes from and how we derive it?
I think so.
And it is, if you see a question like this on the exam, it's not going to ask you like to fill in the blank what the exact value is. It's going to be kind of eyeballing it, and they should be different enough that it's, if you understand the concept, you'll get them correct. I'm not going to put on something that's like, is it 44 or is it 47? Like that's beyond understanding the concept. So it should be obvious.
I think it's just that it felt like a lot of us were doing guesswork when we went through this one.
Yeah, and no problem. And that's why I'm here too, to help, give a little bit more explanation or an alternative explanation to make it make a little more sense.
I know you don't have any control over it, but the lack of videos is hard.
And I honestly, I do appreciate that comment, because those are, I see easy ways that course developers could fix this course. And we would just, write it as students have noticed that the learning like pathways are not, there's some videos, but it would be nice to have multiple learning avenues for every lesson, because some students learn better reading, some students learn better with videos, like in listening to lectures. So I don't think it would take a lot for them to add to this course. So I think that's very fair feedback.
Because they're pulling everything from YouTube, and like for the first exam, we found just a plethora of videos on all the subjects.
The only problem, a lot of these videos in Cogbooks they're self-made. So like if you notice, like Mike Angeletta or Dr. Angeletta is in a lot of the videos, he was the original course developer. So I think the problem with pulling a lot of YouTube videos in Cogbooks is actually like licensing agreements.
Copyrights.
Yeah, copyrights, licensing. If they're open to the public, they can probably get away with it. But then also YouTube videos come and go. So like if you put them in your course the next semester, they might be gone. And then, students, if you don't check it fast enough. So I think there's some legal issues and with Cogbooks and YouTube. Because Cogbooks sells a license for ASU to use it. And I don't know if YouTube, if it's a channel that's monetized, if there's some sort of conflict of interest. That's a little beyond me, but my guess is why they're not flooded with YouTube videos and Cogbooks at the same time.
So it's probably just here, we'll link it to you on YouTube, and whatever you find from there based on the algorithm, like they're free of whatever legal obligations they have by doing that.
That would be my guess, because I think the first video from module 1 was a YouTube video talking about species diversity and genetic diversity, or just biodiversity. So, I mean, I'm just trying to think why they don't do it. And I don't have a solid answer for you.
No, but that makes sense though.
But yeah, if the group, wants to share on the Discord page, the videos, or put it on the community forum on the class, that's, encouraged, find alternative and additional explanations. If anybody wants me to, check out some of those videos, I'd be happy to make sure that, I agree with the content or it aligns with Cogbooks in the way we think it does. Because, YouTube's also, you got to be careful. Most of the time I feel it's pretty good, but sometimes you can put a lot of, incorrect information or not fully correct information. So.
That's true.
I haven't had time to get to T8 yet. I just started it, so I don't have any questions on that yet. But are we going to need to understand glycolysis?
Wait, what?
I don't think so. I mean,
I might have picked that up in one of the extra things. I definitely have it in my notes.
So I'm trying to look through. where
Was it
that would,
under, I found it under like anaerobic respiration, and it talked about fermentation and glycolysis and that.
there's nothing on the exam concerning glycolysis directly, so.
Good, because it just sort of touched on it enough to make me be like, I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, I wouldn't put much
Okay.
focus into that, because I'm not even seeing right now in the modules where the, do you know what was, you said it was one of the additional parts of the module?
I think, I don't know, I've
I
tried
was
to-
from T7 when they were talking about the plants
No, it was in
underwater.
T6.
Oh, was it 6?
Yeah, it was right after the anaerobic respiration part. I think it was part of the anaerobic respiration, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. No, that's not gonna be important for the exam. But one thing I did want to go over too that we haven't touched on yet is explaining countercurrent and concurrent flow. So does somebody want to take a crack at explaining what concurrent flow is?
The concurrent is the water flowing in the same direction as the fluid on the other side of the membrane, and countercurrent is one is going the opposite direction of the other. And countercurrent has a higher threshold of maximum or maximum whatever it is they can exchange versus concurrent flow.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation on how they're a little bit different. My question would be is, let's just stick with the example for sake of simplicity of oxygen and blood and water. So it could be a different gas. Like I said, it doesn't have to be oxygen, but it could be any kind of gas or even a solute potentially. Why does concurrent equilibrate kind of at 50%, but countercurrent does not? So it might be explain how they're kind of different and what is it one more beneficial than the other?
I don't remember why it occurs, but I'm assuming like since you can exchange solutes, gases, or even heat, concurrent would be better than countercurrents because you don't lose a ton of heat really fast.
But countercurrent allows like in fish, countercurrent is how their gills work, right? So it allows the uptake of oxygen, a higher level of oxygen uptake at a faster rate, right?
Yeah, if we
If
think,
it's
sorry, go ahead.
no, it's just that the concurrent doesn't occur in the gills, but it does explain why they
It
use
can.
countercurrent in because it says it does. It said it does not occur in the gills.
Oh, it does right there in front of us. My bad.
I mean, unless there's exceptions to that.
No, that's just something I made the assumption that this was talking about potentially adaptations in fish, and some fish use concurrent and some fish use countercurrent, but no, you're correct. It does say it does not occur in the gills. And the reason being is because of water flow, where the oxygen actually comes from, would be my understanding. But to get the question, kind of what I was getting at is, why is countercurrent flow better than concurrent flow in terms of oxygen uptake in this example?
It has properties like it has to do with osmosis and diffusion. So if it's coming in contact with an uneven balance of oxygen from the water and the blood, then it's going to diffuse across the layers. So if it comes in contact longer at an unequal rate, then it's going to
Has
absorb
more
more
time.
oxygen.
Absolutely, right? The gradient, if we just look at the number of arrows, and that's our gradient, right? Our concentration gradient, the water comes in at 100% to the lowest levels of oxygen in the blood here. And the oxygen is going to diffuse to lower concentration, so into the blood. And there's a gradient, 20 to 100, and then it goes down to 80. And then the blood gains oxygen as the water loses oxygen, but then that gradient disappears when it equilibrates at 50%, right? They're equal, so there's no gradient or there's no pull anymore of oxygen. So it equilibrates at 50%, and that's the maximum saturation that you're gonna get. Now, if it could be different numbers. If the water came in at 80 and it would go down. It could be equilibrated at 40%. It's just whatever the math is eventually that it comes down to being equal. Versus countercurrent is the opposite, right? You actually have the highest levels of oxygen come in the water, meeting the highest levels of oxygen in the blood, but it's not equal. There's still a gradient, so it's still absorbing oxygen, and it's going to continue this gradient all the way through. So it's going to a continuous gain of oxygen, so which is why then it maxes out at potentially 100%, because it has a continuous diffusion of oxygen, where this one has essentially halfway or a limited diffusion of oxygen. And why is oxygen, why is it better to have higher levels of oxygen? Why would an animal
Cellular
evolve?
respiration.
Sure, because oxygen is required for various physiological processes, such as cellular respiration. And those processes are limited by how much oxygen is, absorbed. So that's why if you're in a hypoxic environment, you don't function as well if you're in an environment with more oxygen available, because you have more oxygen to, fulfill more physiological processes.
So if concurrent flow doesn't occur in the gills, where exactly does that one occur, or does it not matter?
Offhand, I'm not positive.
Because I feel like that would make sense in terms of like convection and heat loss, because you don't want an extreme amount of that, but they only talked about it, I think, in the example of the gills. So I don't know if it was just there to say, oh, this is why they adapted this way instead of this way.
I think concurrent's just there as an example to explain countercurrent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'm actually just I'm curious now if concurrent is in other places in the fish. But I think that is a good point, that it is really just trying to show why fish have evolved to have countercurrent flow rather than concurrent flow, because it provides that benefit of getting more oxygen. And as we talked about, selection and evolution is going to favor things that increase survival and fitness. Having more oxygen allows higher levels of performance, which is likely going to contribute to higher levels of fitness.
So we just really don't need to think about it, that particular one, in any greater capacity than what it was mentioned in.
Yeah, so understand
Okay.
the brief explanation of both and how they're different, and why countercurrent is more advantageous. Why is that an adaptation that stuck?
Gotcha.
Yeah, we're doing great, but at the same time, just to make everybody sort of on the same page, someone mentioned they haven't gotten through module 8 yet, which is okay. We're going to have another set of office hours on Thursday that we can cover more materials, but I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer if we have more questions.
I'm currently on topic 8. I was just wondering, for the determinate growth, that was specifically relating to the females of the species, right?
Said determinate growth.
Yeah, determinate growth, I think the definition they gave was they grow to, or it sounded like they were saying, for example, females grow to a certain size and then begin to reproduce. Once they start, they don't continue to grow. And I was just wondering, it's like, was it just like exactly that females of the species tend to be that example, or is it specific to females of all species?
I'm not finding do you know which topic that's coming from? Because I just looked at my notes and I don't have determinate growth. I mean, because I know it talks about size at reproductive age, and that varies based on there's the
I
trade-offs.
think
Is it the
I-
cost
it's
of
on-
reproduction?
I think it was to grow or reproduce
Oh, okay.
in that section. And I think it was towards the beginning of it.
Okay, that's when it's showing female age at sexual maturity on the x-axis, and then expected survival past sexual maturity, and you have different organisms. Yeah, and those are gonna be, I think this was just a specific study because there's gonna be that size at sexual maturity for males and females, and they have different driving factors that determine, what's important for males or females. And for females, it's generally survival, and depending on the species of male, it can be competition. So it could be that they grow to larger sizes until they reach sexual maturity so that they're bigger and they can outcompete rival males. They have a better chance of mating, versus females might just determine what size they are at sexual maturity based on their survival or how many offspring that they can produce. So there's going to be a few selection factors determining the size at sexual maturity, and those can differ within a species for males and females.
Okay, so it's not specific to the gender of the animal.
No, and I think that was
Okay.
just an example where they used female because they're the ones that have the offspring. So I think they were,
Okay. I think the only other thing that was messing with me, and this one was drawing, was it the tangent line for the graph reading activities? But I don't think there's any way to save me from that.
yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about, I'll share my screen again. Talking about these activities, right?
Actually, I think, no, yeah, these ones.
Because this
yeah.
one, just for example, like the first one, what is the first one's a bad example because that's just where that
Where
hits
it
the line.
starts.
So I think, what is the survivorship of offspring with 100 kilojoules of energy? Yeah,
Was
so
that one, and I think it was the one immediately after that when they were trying to, they were like, oh, if you have 1,000 kilojoules of energy to invest in it, what's the optimal clutch size or something like that?
yeah, the clutch size is one I think this is. Yeah, assuming female is 1,000 kilojoules, how many offspring will be yeah. So this is there's like three pieces of information, right? We have energy invested per offspring, we have survivorship, and then we have the energy that the female has available for reproduction. And what we're talking about with the tangent line, for those that aren't sure, haven't got to this yet, is we want to find the tangent line like right here. You would draw a solid line across that because that's going to give us our maximum survivorship before we start losing investment. So that's why we want the tangent line, and you draw that and you can go straight down to find out the energy invested. So for this one, we have the optimal energy invested per offspring from that center, the tangent line would be about 100. And if we have 1,000 available, we put 100 in each, then the optimal number of offspring would be 10. That 1,000 divided by 100 is 10. Does that make sense how we got to that number?
It does. It's just like when I was trying to draw it on myself, doing the problems, I just couldn't get it. I couldn't draw it, I guess, to lead me to that same conclusion. And I think I just like need to practice this or something.
Yeah, a practice would be helpful for sure, because I think there's a couple of these questions, and without being able to physically draw it, I think is a little bit of a limitation. But you could just kind of work backwards from knowing the answer, where would that be in the math equation? So it'd be 100. And then just practicing like visually looking for that, the center of the inflection point, essentially, where the curve starts shifting from increasing to decreasing.
Okay. I think that was just the most confusing thing for me personally on this section.
Sure, and I think this video has some information where they actually draw it kind of on the board and show where that tangent line looks like. So that might give you some more visual representation or practice on how to apply that tangent line.
Okay.
I don't know if it helps, but if the way I did it was by solving, basically dividing 1,000 by each one and then seeing where that would plot on the actual graph. And
Okay.
5 was 200 and that was way too high up at the top, and then 15 was just kept getting lower and lower. So I picked 10 as the best available option since 5 was way too high.
That's a great suggestion. Yeah, kind of working the same problem, but just a different path. That you have options here. So yeah, you can plug all of these into the equation. Yeah, and if you're on the edges at all, you know, the extremes are not good. You're looking to be as close to the middle of this line as possible. So awesome.
All right, thank you.
Do we have any other questions or topics that anybody wants to go over?
Yeah, can we, I don't want to monopolize this. The mineral solubility section of, I think that was T7. Let's see, I have it noted. Oh no, that was in T6. So like I understand that water is a very powerful solvent. And they were talking about the solubility, mineral solubility in freshwater versus salt water. And I know that temperature increases the solubility. Mineral concentration in water happens because of a polar molecule. And salt ions are more attracted to water. Is that true with all minerals, that like most of their ions are attracted to water and that's why they dissolve?
If they dissolve, yes, but there are some ions that are not soluble, so it is going to be ion specific.
Right, yeah, I was thinking about solubility specifically. So the ones that are dissolving, it's because they are more attracted to water than their formation itself, chemical equation.
I mean, I guess, what do you mean by attracted to water? Because there's like, are you talking about like polarity?
Yeah, there we go. That's what, yeah, can you go over that? I
And
feel like I don't have enough in my notes. That was in T6. I think I was early on.
Is that the adaptation of aquatic plant section,
Or
which?
yeah, aquatic creatures is what I have. No, it was before the aquatic plant. I think it was before the freshwater animal adaptations.
At the very beginning when they talked about osmoregulation stuff?
After that, in my note, it's after osmotic pressure.
After the sharks and stuff?
Before that.
Before the sharks.
Mhm.
Like when they're talking about.
I didn't take any notes on that at all.
I don't think they talk about polarity specifically in cogbooks, but I could be wrong. I'm trying to go through my notes too. I know they didn't talk about this topic. Yeah, polarity is not coming up mine.
Yeah, I have under mineral solubility, because of the slight negative charge of oxygen and positive charge of hydrogen, water is polar, and that the polar nature allows attraction to other polar compounds.
Was this in some of the additional material by chance?
Maybe.
Because I'm trying to find in the actual text and I'm not seeing it.
I definitely felt like some of the additional material was confusing me more instead of helping me understand what it was I was trying to find information about.
So there's nothing about polarity and osmotic like potential like we're talking on the exam.
Okay,
So
so I don't need to, and okay, I have like a whole page of notes on it. Interesting. Okay.
No, that's fair. I'm gonna look into that a little bit more because I don't review all of the extra materials because they're supposed to just re-explain the main materials, and that's where the exam material comes from, is like all the main materials. But if they're adding in a bunch of details, I might ask them why. Because if we don't get into like the water chemistry and
I found that on a couple of different things in T6.
okay, I'll go over T6 in a bit more detail before our next office hours and see what some of those additional videos all contain. Because I don't want to send people, because I recommend them because they're supposed to be helpful, but if they're just adding information and making it more confusing in this case, then that's the opposite of what we want.
Yeah, I don't think in T6 there were any videos. It was all just additional reading material.
Well, there was a series of videos called Sealing the Ecological Envelope there were 3 parts, and that was
Oh yeah, at the end, yeah.
yeah, at the end, but then that didn't cover a lot of the adaptation examples that we talked about in the earlier part. So yeah, this was a very short section for sure. But there are a lot of terms and some concepts in it. But yeah, getting into that level of water chemistry is not going to be necessary for the exam.
All right, sorry I confused everyone with that.
No, but honestly, you brought up a good point. I'm sure you're not the only one that has watched those extra videos, and it's good for all of us to know the details in there are not going to be necessary, so we don't need to spend extra time on them reviewing. We can focus on some more of the main content that's going to be more on the exam. So I think it was a helpful comment.
All right, this was helpful. Thank you.
No problem. I'm glad.
Oh, weird question on was it the conceptualized relationship between the life history traits and the environment conditions that J. Philip Grime came up with, or do we just have to know like the gist of it, basically?
Can you repeat that? Sorry. It was the life history traits of.
It's the one with the triangle, and they're talking about classifying it might have been plants or something as either competitors, rooterals, or stress tolerators.
Okay, yeah, so the 3 types of plants. Yeah, so there's that box. Let me share my screen real quick. So there's this box right here. Knowing the information in that is going to be the most important. So just knowing what some of the trade-offs are for plants that are stress tolerators. The potential growth rate would be slower. The age of sexual maturity is late compared to plants as competitors. The potential growth is going to be fast, and the age of sexual maturity is going to be early. And we can maybe talk about why we would see some of these differences. Why would something that has a lot of competitors want a fast growth rate and a early age at sexual maturity?
Okay, so then the triangle is just it's just a visual thing.
Yes, yeah, and then it organizes the information in this table. And I think, yeah,
That
these are
freaks
just
me out a little.
these are just 3 examples of types of plants. I mean, right, there's more competitive plants than goldenrod, and there's more stress tolerators than the woolly lousewort. So I think they just chose 3 plants, one of each, just to show kind of how they would relate.
Okay.
And I think it just talked about, just to describe them, right? Like rudderals, the important thing to remember with what that word is they grow in areas that have regular disturbances. ones that are stress tolerators, obviously there's going to be some type of stress. It could, be desert plants that have very high temperatures and dry environments, right? That's very stressful environment. Or
Okay,
competitive plants like goldenrod, where there's tons of seeds and they grow really fast and they try to choke, the other plants out. And that kind of gets at why I was asking, growth rate for a plant that's considered a competitor is very important, because the ones that grow the fastest are going to get the sun and they're going to choke out and shade out the slower growing ones. So that's why it pushes them to have that, they've adapted to have that fast growth rate.
okay.
There any other questions, or we're good for tonight and pick up on Thursday, or how we feeling?
I'm good. Thank you.
No
I think
problem?
I'm okay too.
Okay, cool. Then I will get working on uploading this video and make it available a little later tonight. And I will see everybody on video on Thursday. And if anybody has any, questions or comments, obviously you can contact me whenever through the support questions or directly through email. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.